Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, I take you on a new journey. And this time, we're going to travel to the long lost trails of the Andes Mountains, to jungles, to deserts, to the shores of mountain lakes with crystal clear waters. For thousands of years, human civilizations have risen, declined, transformed, or vanished. In South America, many cities and states flourished, leaving behind countless remains, some of which may still await discovery. But as far as we know, no civilization or empire was as successful as the Incas at expanding, building, and governing a large empire that at its height dominated the west of South America, from Colombia in the north to Chile in the south, over thousands of miles. An empire with a wide range of climates, different peoples, different landscapes, but a single almighty emperor, the Sapa Inca, who ruled over his land from his capital, Cusco, in modern Peru. In the 16th century, the Inca Empire was still young, and maybe it would have expanded even more. But disaster struck it from the north, from Central America, and with ships that landed on the Pacific coast. Mysterious invaders from an unknown continent arrived and brought down the empire. They were accompanied and even preceded by devastating epidemics. The empire fell into civil war. They managed to capture the Sapa Inca, and they were helped by some of the subjugated peoples that now turned against their previous masters, the Spanish conquistadors, because it was them who were looking for conquests, treasures, and glory, and they found all three well beyond their wildest dreams. In a few years, the glorious empire of the Incas was dislocated, conquered, and colonized. The majority of the former subjects of the Sapa Inca either died of unknown diseases or were enslaved. The empire was no more, and no new indigenous South American civilization would ever rise again. But this does not erase the past, and this is what we will explore tonight. From the first arrivals of human beings in South America to the rise and fall of the Inca Empire. But first, I would like to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page, because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to several exclusive episodes. We add a new one every month, and you can listen and download all the episodes with and without background sounds. And as a token of gratitude, we offer advance releases to our patrons. We have added links to Patreon, as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find them in the description of the episode. And now, before we begin, if you wish to, You may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, off we go. So, as I was telling you, the Incas were the last of various civilizations in the Andes Mountains, the mountain range that stretches south to north in South America from Chile and Argentina in the south, across Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, all the way north to Colombia. This region of the world is regarded as one of the cradles of urban civilizations. The cradles, that is to say, the place where human civilizations, with cities with a relatively high degree of complexity, arose by themselves without being derivatives of another civilization that already had acquired these characteristics. These pristine civilizations were all based on an agricultural model that produced enough food to sustain people not working in food production: administrators, priests, artisans. By definition, people who live in cities don't spend time, or not all of their time, producing or gathering food. So, in order to have cities, you need food surpluses produced by others. Based on that definition of what a civilization is, there are at least 4 cradles in the Old World: in ancient China, in India, in Mesopotamia, and in Egypt. These are all places where urban civilizations arose, starting more than 5,000 years ago. As far as we know, none of these early civilizations in these places had a president. And there are 2 more of these cradles in the Americas: one in Mesoamerica, roughly the south of modern Mexico, which is the place where peoples like the Olmecs, Toltecs, the Maya, the Aztecs lived, and one in South America, centered on Peru. The oldest civilization or urban culture in South America, and actually in all of America, is one called Caral-Supe, near the Pacific coast, in the center of Peru. Its oldest archaeological remains have been dated to 5,500 years ago, and this civilization included various population centers, towns, or cities, as many as 30. The main one is called Caral, and because it was the largest and most spectacular one, it gave its name to the entire culture. And it is a really impressive sight, despite its age, with pyramids and elaborate urbanism. The people of the Caral-Supe civilization practiced agriculture, and it is not clear that it was their primary source of food. It is possible, making them unusual among early civilizations, that marine resources, such as fish and shellfish, played an even more important role in their diet. Of course, When we define civilization with criteria like cities, a writing system, an agriculture, a state, and its administration, a society with hierarchy, this is a way of looking at human cultures that is not completely neutral or independent. There is a point of view. This definition was decided or formulated by scholars and archaeologists who themselves are the product, descendants of such urban cultures. And this is not a new phenomenon. Already in antiquity, the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Chinese judged other cultures based on what they knew, and oftentimes very harshly. But returning to the present, such a definition of civilization could end up excluding certain cultural traits, such as the absence of a writing system in societies where knowledge is transmitted orally, or the absence of stone architecture, since structures built from wood or other perishable materials do not always leave lasting traces. On the other hand, it is difficult to study ancient cultures that left no trace behind, without remains to examine or written records to read. Even their existence can be hard to establish, leaving little tangible evidence to work with. It is also a fact that cultures without cities, or at least food surpluses, cannot place themselves on a path of steady technical progress, of accumulation of knowledge generation after generation. New technical discoveries and their transmission require a degree of specialization within the population, as well as a sufficiently large community to ensure that knowledge survives the loss of any one individual. Written documents are obviously a great plus here. Without these characteristics, without this basic prosperity, it is impossible for a human group to progress technically. And this is why there is not really an alternative definition of what civilization is. Civilization requires a large group of people sharing a common culture with a relatively complex society in which there are different roles and hierarchies. This is why urbanization, a written system, and a list of discoveries are pertinent criteria. It is also interesting to compare these pristine or primary civilizations around the world, because they share the traits even though they were not in contact. Their cultural and social traits tell us of how human beings adapt to a necessity, to the environment, to a geography, the climate. And there are also similarities that appear spontaneously in human groups that were very distant and were never in contact. So these comparisons tell us of our capacity to adapt and also what we have in common as a species, as social animals. So coming back to South America, the Andes were one such cradle of early civilization. And civilization started very quickly there because it was also one of the last, if not the last, big regions of the world to be populated by humans. It is believed that the first humans reached South America via the Isthmus of Panama. After spreading through North America, and the earliest evidence of settlement in the Andean region dates back to around 15,000 BC, about 17,000 years ago. As I mentioned, the first evidence of an urban civilization appeared in the 4th millennium BC, Caral-Supe in Peru. And after that, archaeology indicates that various other Andean cultures, from Colombia to Chile, lasted for centuries and declined or were absorbed by others. We are talking of several thousands of years before the Incas appeared as a state. But during this time, probably due to distances and an absence of contact with other continents, Andean civilizations or Andean cultures maintained particular traits that made them unique in the world. So, what are these traits? First, as far as we know, none of them ever developed a written language, but instead, they used a way of conveying information called the quipu. The quipu consists of a main string to which more strings, more cords, are attached in different colors and with knots. Quipus can be of different sizes. The word quipu means knot in most varieties of Quechua. Quechua is the family of languages that was and remains spoken in and around Peru. So a quipu could have only a few cords or up to thousands, in which case it could contain as much information as a book. So quipus were a way of encoding numeric information, collecting data, keeping records, keeping track of the calendar, or for military organization or taxes. The cultures that used them could give different meanings to the colors, the knots, and the distances between the knots. Because a quipu is an object or a method to convey information, like a book can be, it is not a language. And actually, the knowledge of reading them disappeared during colonial times in the Andes. So the information in the new ancient surviving quipus that we still have can no longer be read. It has been argued, and this is controversial, that quipus were more than that and were actually a written language in its own right. This was never formally proven, but it was observed that some patterns of knots and colors could have been used to designate places or possibly names of people or even dates. This could suggest that the system would have been used as a kind of writing system, one in which colors, knots, and distances between knots would have replaced the symbols, the alphabet, or ideograms and pictograms that we are familiar with in other writing systems. But there is no definitive proof of this. It seems the knowledge necessary to read quipus was always limited to a small minority of people. Maybe because the information enclosed in them was strategically important. It certainly was in the Inca Empire, where very few people apparently could decipher a quipu. This likely also made the loss of this knowledge more likely. Apart from this original system to store information, Andean civilizations had other specificities. Another one was the absence of wheeled vehicles. They never used the wheel to make chariots or wheelbarrows. This is surprising because this type of vehicle appeared relatively early in civilizations of the Old World. These are cheap and inefficient ways of improving productivity and transporting things. Of course, many Andean cultures lived in mountains where the use of wheeled vehicles was not always viable, but not all of them. There are also deserts and plateaus that are flat. So a better reason for this absence of wheels could be the absence of draft animals. There were no horses or camels or cattle in the region, and this didn't leave many options. The llama was the domesticated animal that came closest to a horse. But llamas are not that strong. They can only carry about a fourth of their weight, a maximum of 100 pounds. And so they were not big or strong enough to be used for plowing or as riding animals. So the transportation of goods was made only by foot, with llamas carrying up to their 100 pounds on their backs or by people. Yet another original trait of these cultures was the absence of money and markets, of markets where you buy things. We don't exactly know how their economies worked. This is still debated. But a major difference with others is that no coins or places for trade could ever be found in their ruins, contrary to civilizations of the Old World. So between the absence of currency and of physical places where to trade, it seems the economy was organized on reciprocity and redistribution, maybe at the scale of a community, a village, a city, or even a state. Goods were held in common and shared among individuals or families according to an allocation system that remains unclear, though not necessarily an egalitarian one. Maybe it was between people of the same social standing. But these Andean societies also had very fierce hierarchies. There was an elite of nobles alongside a large population of common people, and the two did not share the same means or status. This, too, was a feature of the Inca civilization that had its origins in much earlier times. To conclude that list of specificities, I could mention one last aspect of all the cradles of civilizations. The Andean one is probably the one with the most natural challenges to deal with when you compare it to others, especially in the Old World. You see that the regions where urban civilizations flourished had a warm climate, but not too warm, fertile land. If you think about Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Indus Valley, they had a relatively flat and abundant arable land. These were all positive factors for agricultural surpluses to appear. In comparison, Andean peoples were not dealt a very good hand. The Andean environment is more challenging. The first known civilization I mentioned earlier appeared on the coast of Peru, in the desert that was very arid and where only irrigation made agriculture possible. The same in valleys crossed by rivers coming from the Andes. There is a lot of water because glaciers store it in the mountains and release it in warmer seasons. But these rivers, flowing in valleys and straight to the Pacific Ocean in a few hundred miles at most, are very different from the slow and large rivers of ancient China, India, or the Middle East. So water had to be retained to irrigate fields, and there is also a scarcity of flat lands in the Andes. As soon as you start climbing and above 10,000 feet, that's 3,000 meters, the temperature becomes very cold. It can freeze at night at any time of the year. Many parts of the Andes are also very dry. Rainfall is scarce, and the soil is thin, both of which make agriculture more difficult. And yet these ancient cultures often appeared in the mountains, where the conditions were some of the harshest. They came up with solutions like terraces for agriculture, irrigation, warm clothing, the optimization of every possible resource, and actually the kind of redistributive economy that seems to dominate in these cultures may have been a consequence of these harsh conditions. The deep understanding that survival was difficult and depended on society as a whole may have prevented more individualistic conceptions of life from emerging. It has been proposed as a hypothesis that this kind of phenomenon also appeared in parts of Asia, like in Japan or some regions of China, and contributed to shape societies and individuals' psychologies. In any case, a defining feature of these ancient Andean cultures is their ability to adapt and make the most of fundamentally harsh conditions. So, as you see, they had their unique traits, from the absence of a writing system as we generally understand it, to these adaptation skills, or the absence of cattle or horses. And yet, like another cradles of civilization, they discovered a lot of essential techniques: pottery, weaving and textile, metallurgy. Even though pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas largely remained at a Bronze Age level of metallurgy and did not smelt iron, they only encountered iron tools and weapons with the arrival of the Spanish. And apart from techniques, these people elaborated complex societies and states with a particularly efficient administration. We'll see that when I tell you about the Inca Empire. They acquired a good understanding of astronomy, something common to many pre-Columbian civilizations, rich and diversified production of crafts and art pieces. They perfected their agriculture, and so, even without wheeled vehicles or iron tools, these were really advanced cultures for their time. Apart from Caral-Supe, which I already mentioned, other major ancient Andean civilizations include the Valdivia culture in modern-day Ecuador, another coastal settled culture that flourished almost at the same time between the 4th and the 2nd millennia BC. There was also the Chavin culture in the Peruvian highlands in the 1st millennium BC. This one was contemporary to classical Greece. In the 1st millennium AD, there was the Nazca culture, also in Peru, famous for these large lines that they created that represented giant animals seen from the sky. And also in the 1st millennium, as the Roman Empire rose and fell and Europe entered the Dark Ages, other cultures appeared like the Moche, Chachapoyas, or the Wari, and Tiwanaku empires, early precursors to the Inca Empire. Some of these cultures were from the Pacific coast, some from the mountains, and some on the other side of the Andes. The Chachapoyas, for example, lived in cloud forests, that is to say, humid high altitude tropical forests in the northeast of Peru. And in the second millennium, in the centuries prior to the colonial conquest, plenty of different kingdoms, chiefdoms, or federations sharing similar cultures and languages kept appearing, like the Muisca in Colombia, the Chimu in the north of Peru, the Aymara kingdoms in Bolivia that replaced this Tiwanaku Empire I mentioned earlier. And I'm only listing some of the most famous. There were many more. These states had one or several urban centers, and some of them expanded, subjugating other peoples or forming federations with peoples who wanted to join them. This is what the Tiwanaku Empire did. It originated from the Altiplano, the second largest high plateau in the world after Tibet. It is mostly in modern Bolivia, but there are bits in Peru and Chile, even though it is called an empire, and it did expand well beyond its base, with either colonies or settlements that imitated it. It is unsure whether Tiwanaku was a state with an army and one or several ruling dynasties. It may have been more akin to a kind of federation of peoples. Although Tiwanaku left behind substantial architecture, the most famous example being the Gateway of the Sun, a monumental stone gate. There is, contrary to one might expect, little evidence of defensive structures or significant weaponry in the archaeological record. So this suggests that Tiwanaku could have been more of a cultural and religious area rather than a kingdom. Little is known about it, but what is certain is that in the centuries prior to the emergence of the Inca Empire, Tiwanaku occupied or covered the region where the Incas would emerge, and so it influenced them significantly. At the same time as Tiwanaku, another formation to the northwest was the Wari Empire. Here again, it is called empire, but it could have been a political formation of uncertain nature, or maybe just a network of towns and villages sharing the same culture. We don't know. The Wari lasted a bit longer and also influenced the future Incas. The early history of the Incas is full of question marks because there are no written documents that we would know of. And so, the only elements that helped recreate it are archaeology and the oral tradition that existed in the 16th century at the time of the conquest and was collected, probably imperfectly, and at a time when the line between history and myth was not very clear. But still, the main lines of this history could be established with a good level of certainty. So once the Tiwanaku and Wari empires dislocated, they were replaced in the 12th century by a collection of small kingdoms. I mentioned these Aymara kingdoms of the Altiplano earlier that succeeded Tiwanaku to the south of Peru, and west of Bolivia were covered by numerous small states and independent tribes. The Inca people were one of them. The legend says that in the early 13th century, the Incas were ruled by a man called Manco Capac, and he would have been the founder of the Inca civilization. In reality, Manco Capac could very well have existed, but it is uncertain because he is known mainly through legends, chronicles that retell the foundation of what would become an empire. Apart from that, there is no tangible proof that he existed. But in any case, the first Incas formed a small kingdom, a small city-state, like there were many at the time in the area of the city of Cusco. And for about 200 years, this little kingdom, ruled by kings, existed and prospered before it became the seat of the Inca Empire. But it is time to do a bit of etymology. We speak of Inca Empire or the Incas, but this was not how these people called themselves. The Incas referred to their empire as Tawantinsuyu, a word from Quechua that means the quartet or the group of 4 provinces. In Quechua, Tawa means 4 and Ntin is a suffix that means a group. So Tawantinsuyu means a group of 4 things or 4 elements taken together, and Suyu is a region or a province. So Tawantinsuyu is a quartet of provinces, the 4 provinces of the Inca Empire that met at the capital. But Inca is originally not the name of the people. It means ruler or lord in Quechua. And centuries ago, the term Inca was probably understood with a broader sense. It also included the nobles that ruled over the mass of the population. So the term Inca named a small elite of rulers, the masters. It is only in modern times that the Incas became the name of the people as a whole, the people that populated the Inca Empire. The emperors and before them, the kings of Cusco, were called Sapa Inca. Sapa means the only one, so we could translate this title as supreme or unique ruler. I mentioned before that Inca society had a hierarchy. At its peak, its population could have reached about 10 to 12 million people spread along the Andes from Ecuador to Chile. But the number of nobles, people that governed locally or from the court of the emperor in Cusco, has been estimated between 15,000 and 40,000, less than 0.5% of the population. So the Incas, the rulers, were certainly a small group. With these numbers, there would have been about 300 common people for one noble. For comparison, the number of nobles in European medieval societies was estimated to be between 1 and 3% of the population, depending on the countries and the periods. It could vary a lot. For example, in the 18th century, well after the Middle Ages, there were kingdoms like Poland or Castile, where the noble population could surpass 10% of the whole population. But at the same time, it was 2 to 3% in Russia, 1% in France, and less than 1% in Sweden. But still, this Inca nobility, this aristocracy, when you compare it with other societies, was really a small and exclusive group, and we can suppose from it that they lived with a degree of power and material comfort that was remarkable. So returning to the Kingdom of Cusco, for about 200 years and under 8 different kings, or 8 different Sapa Inca, they started calling themselves like this. By the mid-14th century, the kingdom remained relatively small, and apart from the succession of monarchs, we don't really know much about its political life or possible conflicts with neighbors. Information is limited, and, like for the figure of Manco Capac, history and legend are too intertwined to really know what happened. But all this changed with the 9th Sapa Inca of the Kingdom of Cusco, Pachacuti. At the time of his accession, it seems the Kingdom of Cusco was still not impressive at all. Cusco itself was a village with a royal house and a few other buildings, but it was not spectacular at all. And many kingdoms of Peru and the Altiplano were probably larger and wealthier. But Pachacuti turned out to be an expansionist king and a conqueror, and his reign lasted 33 years, from 1438 to 1471. He was the sole ruler from 1438 to 1463 for 25 years, after which power was shared, waiting for the accession of his successor. 1438, the beginning of Pachacuti's reign, was a starting point of Inca expansion. And you see that we were just 54 years before Columbus's journey to America, and 8 years before the conquest of Mexico by the Spanish against the Aztecs. This is actually the time window during which the Inca Empire rose. So, first in 3 decades, with a mix of military campaigns and diplomacy, Pachacuti enlarged the Kingdom of Cusco in every direction. He created a larger kingdom of the mountains by following the Andes to the north and south of Cusco. It is widely admitted that Machu Picchu, a retreat or a family home for emperors, was built for him. As Pachacuti aged, he named one of his sons, Tupac, as a co-ruler and successor, and Tupac continued the conquest with even more success. Tupac focused on the north, conquering western Peru and Ecuador, advancing as far as what is now the border between Ecuador and Colombia. And after his father's death in 1471, he focused on the south for 20 years, annexing the entire Altiplano and the northern half of Chile, plus bits of what is now Argentina on the other side of the Andes. But what made the Incas so successful at expanding like this, not only farther than any Andean civilization that preceded them, but so much faster? The main explanation that often emerges is their economy, or their productive capacity. I already mentioned that ancient Andean economies seemed to ignore currencies and relied on communal production. The Incas had such a system, but they were very efficient at centralizing and managing production. This meant more food surpluses, and so more men available, bigger armies, and better equipment than any of their neighbors. Actually, many of their conquests at the time of Pachacuti and Tupac were diplomatic, rather than military. They sent emissaries to their neighbors with gifts for the local nobles and offered them to join the Inca state. They would be better off because they would join the Inca elite themselves and benefit from the Sapa Inca's protection and highly efficient administration. As time passed, infrastructure such as roads were added to the list of advantages, so it made sense to just pledge allegiance and join the empire. That was the carrot. If they refused, there was the stick too, which was an invasion, and if they lost, they would be executed. Once the Inca Empire had acquired a critical mass of population and armies by the reign of Tupac, it made a lot of sense to just comply with it. And this explains, in part, the very fast expansion of the empire in the second half of the 15th century. It had just become irresistible. Still, there were wars with some of its neighbors, especially as the frontiers were pushed farther and farther from Cusco. For example, a large conflict that the Incas won eventually erupted with the Empire of Chimu, another empire that stretched along the coast of Peru to the south. They were stopped by a defeat in central Chile against the local Mapuche natives, who populated the south and center of Chile and also lived in the west of Argentina. So there were conflicts, battles, and occasional setbacks. Yet for the rest of the 15th century, the expansion remained remarkably rapid, and the Inca civilization never relinquished any territory they had previously conquered. Yet another explanation for the fast rise of the Incas could be a small climate shift that took place in the 15th century. Temperatures became slightly warmer in southern Peru, and precipitations increased. This opened vast lands in the mountains for agriculture, lands that could not be cultivated before. The Inca civilization had already mastered this form of mountain agriculture, using terraces to cope with thin soils and harsh conditions, allowing them to make the most of these new environments. And the boost in food and arable land could have also helped their expansion. So by the end of the reign of Tupac in 1493, at this point, Columbus had already landed in the Caribbean. But no one knew that in the Inca Empire, and the empire now stretched along the Andes for thousands of miles. It had an estimated 10 to 12 million inhabitants. For comparison, Spain around the year 1500 had an estimated population of 6.5 million. Great Britain 2.5 million. This population put the Inca Empire in 7th position worldwide, population-wise, right behind the Ottoman Empire, but ahead of the Aztec Empire, which had an estimated 6 million inhabitants. With such a size, and even more with such a quick conquest, the empire had become an amalgamation of different peoples, cultures, and languages. It takes time to integrate different peoples into a single state, and the Inca elite seems to have been very aware of the need to further integrate, to assimilate peoples into this original North-South empire that followed a mountain range over thousands of miles. Roads were built, entire populations were moved around the empire. Typically, when a new people was conquered or integrated within the boundaries of the Inca Empire, they would be sent to a completely different region. This was a way of getting people from their culture and their attachment to a particular land and ensuring that they would be more loyal. After a generation or two, their old culture would have been forgotten and replaced with Inca culture. But still, the conquest had been very quick. It was still fresh when the Spanish arrived, and in regions that were far away from Cusco, the loyalty of the local nobles, and more generally, the subjects of the Incas, was still questionable. We already talked a bit about these cultural traits that were common to all Andean civilizations, of which the Incas are a part of. But apart from that, what was Inca society like? First, I give you estimates of the population of around 10 to 12 million. But these have to be taken with caution. Actually, the Incas probably knew quite well how many subjects populated each of their 4 provinces. Their administration was very developed, and records of everything were kept on quipus. But as I mentioned before, most quipus were lost, and the knowledge necessary to read them disappeared. So we ignore the numbers they contained. Estimates of the population of the Inca Empire at its peak range from 4 to 36 million inhabitants. Very low or very high estimates are often considered less credible, as they tend to be driven by political motives, such as to suggest that the colonizers barely murdered anyone, or the opposite, that they committed massacres or indirectly killed tens of millions in the Andes due to war, the diseases, and forced labor. To be clear, all of these things did happen with colonization, but it doesn't mean the numbers have to be exaggerated. Almost all estimates regarded as serious by historians fall within a range from 6 to 14 million people, and the vast majority of them worked to produce food and crafts. And as we saw before, everything was centralized when it came to production, so people would give their labor to the state, and all their basic needs, clothing or food, were covered, were given to them in exchange. Communities also had to pay a tribute in nature: grain, meat, wool, clothes in nature, because there were no coins, and precious metals like silver and gold were used to make ornaments or jewelry, but not currency. The centralization of resources also permitted the empire to redistribute when harvests were bad in a region, and so being part of the empire was kind of an insurance against famines in ancient societies. And that was still true all around the world in the 15th and 16th centuries. The food supply was always a big concern, even when there were good years and people could stock up. 2 or 3 consecutive years of bad harvests were enough to start famine anywhere. So a state capable of bringing food from hundreds of miles away and offering protection against hunger was a blessing for these communities. What did they eat, by the way? A quite wide variety of crops were cultivated. Some were native to the Americas, and they were exported later after the colonial conquest, like potatoes, tomatoes, or corn. They also had peanuts and different vegetables, different fruits, and pseudo grains like quinoa. A pseudo grain or a pseudo cereal is a plant that is not a grass like cereals, but is used very much the same way. So people of the Andes didn't have wheat or rice, but they had quinoa and another pseudo cereal called amaranth. For ordinary people, the diet was mostly plant-based, and it was complemented with fish near the coastlines and meat from guinea pigs and llamas in particular, which were raised for their wool and their meat. So, returning to the history of the empire, by the year 1520, the empire had reached its peak in terms of expansion under Emperor Huayna Capac, who had extended its territory further to the north. But a deadly threat was coming from the north, the Spanish conquistadors. Between 1519 and 1521, the Spanish, led by Hernan Cortes, had brought down the Aztec Empire in Mexico. In the 1520s, explorations through Central America detected the existence of yet another large and wealthy empire to the south this time, and actually larger, more populated, and probably even wealthier than the Aztecs. They reached Inca territory by 1526, and with them, unwittingly, came pathogens and new diseases that, even before the war with the Spanish began, had already started to bring the Inca Empire to its knees. You know that well ahead of wars, a major cause of mortality among pre-Columbian populations in America was the introduction of pathogens that were unknown on the continent. Many people from North or South America had no pre-existing immune defenses against them. Diseases like smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles. We don't know how many subjects of the Incas this first wave of diseases killed, but it certainly disorganized the empire. It made different peoples and nobles realize that they may have an opportunity to recover their independence, and smallpox even killed the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac, together with his designated heir, triggering a succession war. As this was happening, a Spanish conquistador called Francisco Pizarro had traveled back to Spain and obtained royal approval in 1529 to conquer the Incas and govern this new land that the Spanish now called New Castile or Peru. The conquest of Mexico had been one of the most, maybe even the most, immediately profitable expeditions in history. A small group of men, aided by their advanced equipment and the political situation with different peoples ready to revolt against the Aztecs, and also a lot of luck, had been able to send back inconceivable treasures to Spain, a mountain of gold and other treasures. So they now hoped the same operation could be repeated with the Incas, and it would be repeated indeed. Pizarro had been given the green light in Spain in 1529 to invade the Incas. In 1532, he was back to South America, and he entered Inca territory with a modest force of 168 men, 27 horses, and only one cannon. That is to say, almost nothing to conquer an empire, even with the technological advantage of gunpowder or steel armor. But once again, the conquistadors were very lucky. Following the death of the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac, and as I mentioned, A succession war had begun. Two of his sons had started this war, Huáscar and Atahualpa. In this chaos, unrest had surged in conquered provinces far from Cusco, and the epidemic was still taking its toll on the empire. The forces of Pizarro only engaged minor garrisons in present-day Ecuador to the north of the Inca Empire, and nothing special was done to stop them because the two pretenders were too busy fighting each other. The fight that finally Atahualpa won, and as he was resting near the city of Cajamarca in the north of Peru, with an army of 80,000 men, that's 500 to 1, against the Spanish, he invited Pizarro for talks. To the Incas, it was just unthinkable that anything could happen to their emperor. He was sacred, chosen by the gods, and more tangibly, he was surrounded by an army of 80,000 men. So the idea that a few dozen conquistadors would try anything probably did not even cross their minds. But the Spanish did try something. They met with Atahualpa, and on the first occasion, they attacked the Inca forces around, who were mostly unarmed. They captured the emperor and, with their emperor prisoner, the Inca soldiers, completely disoriented, obeyed orders to stop fighting. For the price of his liberty, Atahualpa was asked to fill a room from floor to ceiling with gold, and also bring twice that amount of silver, which he did. But they still didn't release him, and finally he was executed in 1533. As the emperor was now a prisoner, and the prestige of the empire had taken a huge hit, many regional leaders just rejected the Sapa Inca and turned to the Spanish for allegiance. They switched overlords, and this helped the Spanish enormously, helped them dismantle and take control of the Inca Empire, which collapsed like a house of cards. For the peoples that had lived under Inca rule, this change of overlords was certainly not positive. At best, they kept living about the same under a noble that now obeyed the Spanish. These nobles were called encomenderos. This was a system in which they managed an area and its inhabitants on behalf of the colonizers, to whom they paid taxes. For ordinary people, it meant more work, and now there were the epidemics, ravaging the Andean region on a regular basis. As I mentioned before, it had begun in the 1520s with smallpox. In the 1540s, there was typhus, and in the 1550s, influenza and smallpox again. These epidemics kept happening for about a century. They lasted into the 17th century, with more smallpox outbreaks, diphtheria, and measles. This, plus forced labor in mines and agriculture, made the indigenous population decrease dramatically along the 16th century. And even though the Spanish rule was imposed from Colombia to Chile, there was a periodic attempt to revolt and expel the Spanish until the late 18th century, but all these rebellions were crushed. The memory and the physical remains of Inca cities did not disappear, obviously. Some, like Cusco, remain populated to this day, and this is why in numerous cities of Peru you can find archaeological remains. Sometimes the foundations of buildings date back to the Inca period. All the languages that were spoken across the Inca Empire declined as Spanish replaced them, and some disappeared. But among native populations of Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, some are still spoken, in particular Quechua. This family of languages nowadays has about 7 million native speakers, half of them from Peru, and most of the others from Ecuador and Bolivia. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to learn and discover more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.